Welcome back, everyone. Let's jump right into today's explainer, where we are unpacking a highly controversial but undeniably foundational piece of history. Ernesto Che Guevara's military manual, Guerrilla Warfare. Originally written to distill the tactical experiences of the Cuban Revolution, this text exploded onto the world stage. It quickly became the ultimate blueprint studied literally everywhere, both by revolutionaries trying to topple governments and by state military academies trying to figure out counterinsurgency tactics. So today, we're going to impartially pop the hood on this text and break down exactly how Guevara conceptualized asymmetrical combat. Okay, let's dive into this. This quote right here absolutely sets the tone for the entire manual. Guevara writes that the guerrilla fighter must be the Jesuit of warfare. So what does he actually mean by that? Well, it means taking any traditional romantic ideas you might have about fair or sporting combat and tossing them right out the window. Instead, the manual asserts that a fighter has to rely heavily on extreme secrecy, calculated treachery, and total surprise. It is strictly a doctrine of survival and opportunistic striking. It's built entirely on the premise that a massively outgunned force literally has to outsmart and outmaneuver a conventional army to stay alive. To get a handle on this complex document, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with the revolutionary premise, move into strategy and tactics, see how terrain dictates the fight, look at the daily life of the guerrilla band, explore the civil structures they build, and finish up with the global legacy of these ideas. Let's start right off with Section 1, the revolutionary premise, a war of the masses. You know, the absolute most crucial, foundational concept in Guevara's manual is that guerrilla warfare is absolutely not some isolated military action carried out by a rogue group in the woods. According to the text, it is fundamentally a mass struggle. The armed group, they're just the vanguard. Without the total support and cooperation of the local civilian population, the manual argues that any armed group is doomed to be wiped out. Because of this, Guevara explicitly defines the combatant, not just as a soldier with a gun, but as an ascetic social reformer. In rural areas, this fighter is cast as an agrarian revolutionary trying to dismantle oppressive land ownership. Guevara instructs that long before the war is actually won, the fighter has to act as a guardian angel to the peasant class, bringing them moral, technical, and cultural help. The text then lays out the actual timeline of this armed struggle in 3 very systematic phases. First up is strategic defense. This is when a tiny, hunted group focuses 100% on just surviving and making quick, isolated strikes. Over time, as they capture arms and gain recruits, they hit the second phase, balance of action. This is where their capabilities finally match the conventional army's strength in very specific zones. Finally, the struggle shifts into phase 3, total annihilation, where the guerrilla force has actually grown into a regular army that's capable of defeating the state's military outright. Moving right along to Section 2, strategy and tactics, the 7 golden rules. Guevara doesn't just offer vague suggestions here. He frames his military doctrine as a strict, non-negotiable set of operational laws, and this brilliantly illustrates the core of his asymmetrical doctrine. If you look closely, the manual strictly forbids defensive last stands or fighting just for pride. The number 1 rule? Never, ever engage in a fight that cannot be won. The force has to move continuously in a hit-and-run pattern. Another absolutely vital rule is relying on the enemy as your main supplier of weapons. Insurgents don't have factories, right? So every single skirmish is basically just a supply run to capture enemy arms and ammo. So, how do these rules translate into psychological warfare? Well, the text bluntly commands the fighters to give the enemy no rest. Period. By systematically hitting outposts and running constant night operations, the goal is to deny the conventional army any sleep or peace whatsoever. Guevara writes that doing this creates this paralyzing illusion for the enemy soldiers, making them feel like they're completely surrounded all the time. It's meant to completely destroy their morale from the inside out. Section 3, adapting to the terrain, mountains versus cities. The manual is incredibly clear that human willpower alone doesn't win a battle. The physical environment heavily dictates the size, the speed, and the tactics of the unit. Just look at the stark contrast Guevara draws. In favorable terrain, like dense mountains or deep forests, guerrillas can actually build secure bases, set up supply lines, and sometimes even operate in broad daylight. But in unfavorable terrain, which means flat plains or dense urban cities, the tactics have to radically shift. The fighter is at a massive disadvantage here. So operations must be strictly nocturnal, totally decentralized, and incredibly rapid. It's an explosive strike followed by an immediate withdrawal, because trying to set up a permanent camp in a city is basically viewed as a death sentence. Section 4. The Guerrilla Band, Life and Discipline. Transitioning over from battlefield tactics to the internal mechanics of the group, this number right here is fascinating. 10. The text explicitly identifies a squad of 8 to 10 fighters as the absolute maximum number of people that can effectively act as a cohesive unit out there. Any more than 10, and the group gets too loud, they move too slowly, and they become way too difficult to feed while constantly on the run. Understanding this really grounds just how extreme the survival aspect of this doctrine actually is. And the life expected of those 10 individuals? It's brutal. Guevara outlines these intense privations where a fighter literally carries their entire life on their back. Their home is the open sky, sleeping under just a piece of waterproof nylon. Their greatest treasures are simply a hammock, their gun, and their shoes. In fact, the text specifically notes that shoes are so highly prized that whoever has a good pair has, quote, the security of a happy existence. It's a surprisingly human detail in a very strict manual. The discipline is totally ironclad, punishing any lapse in vigilance or poor maintenance of those precious weapons. Section 5. Organizing the Front, the Micro-Society. War isn't just about hiding in the woods. As a successful guerrilla movement secures more territory, they eventually have to mimic a functioning government. The manual outlines the distinct, non-combatant roles required to pull this off. You've got a supply branch that sets up barter systems and collects taxes, a justice branch that actually administers laws. Interestingly, the health branch requires doctors to act almost as priests, providing this immense moral support and comfort to the wounded. And the intelligence branch relies heavily on local peasants, not just to gather intel, but to actively sow fear and spread discouraging rumors among the enemy ranks. It's also worth noting that the manual places a very specific emphasis on the indispensable role of women within this micro-society. Guevara actually challenges the prejudices of his era here, noting that women are crucial not just for logistics, but for educating the camp, teaching illiterate recruits how to read, spreading revolutionary theory, acting as social workers, and maintaining those all-important ties between the fighters and the civilian world. If we trace the chronological evolution described in the text, we see a really clear pipeline of how an insurgency actually scales up. It starts in the initial weeks with just a small, isolated nucleus hiding out in rough terrain. By the first few months, they expand into populated areas to start building that mass support. In the following months, they begin functioning like a tiny government, setting up civil laws and courts. And finally, years later, the force grows so large that it splits into brand new columns, projecting their power across the entire country. And finally, Section 6, the global legacy. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how Guevara's mostly rural-focused theories were absorbed and modified by later historical figures. Take a look at the cover of George Jackson's book, Blood in My Eye. Jackson, who was writing from within the American prison system, closely studied Guevara, Mao, and others, but he adapted these theories specifically for urban guerrilla warfare in America. Jackson's writings argued that those exact same asymmetrical principles, extreme mobility, absolute secrecy, and attacking the life support systems of a mechanized state, could be unleashed within the unfavorable terrain of modern cities to create what he called perfect disorder. It just goes to show how incredibly fluid and influential Guevara's original manual became. Which leaves us with this final thought. From the jungles of South America to dense urban centers all across the globe, the mechanics of insurgency detailed in this single text have echoed through decades of history. Regardless of where you stand politically, the sheer tactical realities of how an outgunned force attempts to outmaneuver a superior one remain a constant, fascinating study in military science. So, as you observe global political movements and asymmetrical conflicts today, I leave you with this question. How has the blueprint outlined in this historical manual continued to shape the battlefields of our modern world? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.